as a potential point where to begin our conversation, I would like to refer a brief conversation with Jonas yesterday when I was telling him about the process of writing the talk that you've just listened to, and the kind of unexpected help from life that I got through from yesterday's press. I finally did not find a convincing way to conclude, as I planned for a while, with a most striking image that you may have spotted in yesterday's news, that of Benjamin Netanyahu presenting his diagram of the board, a black diagram of the bomb, to the United Nations, and indicating with a red marker, which is of course interesting for me because black and red are the colors that I've been speaking about. With a red marker, he indicates the point of no return, the point at which uranium enrichment in Iran must be met with a very decisive martial response. With the red marker, he draws a line between life and non-life. It's extremely farcical. It's absolutely insane. I mean, the atomic bomb is represented as Tom and Jerry would draw a bomb, really, and the gesture itself has such a tragicomic intensity that I wonder if it doesn't really inaugurate a new age, perhaps, in a long history of media coups, of carefully staged images. I wonder if it will have the same destiny, for instance, as that apotheosis of fabrication that was the White House picture at the time when Osama bin Laden was being assassinated somewhere else, an event that we could not see, but by its allegorical reflection, by the simulated concern of Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. I made a mistake. I mean, I told Jonas that I would use this image, and he said, okay, you can do that, because I was actually planning to use it as well. So maybe this is, since I didn't use it, maybe this is one place to start. The diagram and the red marker and the mindset and ideological framework where such a thing could exist, could be conceived, and could hope for effectiveness.
Well, what was the reason I was thinking of using the same image is because the type of research that I attempt to do in the meaning of propaganda within the concept that Jacques Ellul proposes as total propaganda. I see that this thing might be blocking. Yes, hi. My approach is one that I call a morphological one, meaning that I try to analyze the meaning of propaganda from its actual visual manifestation rather than from its intention. I think today we still often make the mistake that we think of propaganda as something that is somehow directed from a department of propaganda, but of course propaganda from Ellul's perspective is something that exists in a kind of permanent and very visual sphere. He, for example, discusses the city as a manifestation of propaganda, as a kind of physical infrastructure, ideological and physical infrastructure at the same time, constantly proving its own success. With a very simple example, the skyscraper, even in a country like South Africa, even in a city like Johannesburg, which is incredibly poor and deals with terrible income differences still, the fact that they have the skyscrapers makes you believe that that somehow it's not as bad as it really is. So the city itself somehow pushes an idea of a kind of future capital that will one day come or used to be there, making it somehow impossible to believe in the actual poverty that is there. And so, okay, this is this kind of attempt to understand propaganda from its visual manifestation. And what struck me from Netanyahu's presentation at the United Nations conference, when he showed the statistic, as Mihnea discussed, the growing danger or the growing chance that Israel will attack Iran because of its nuclear danger or threat, was that he used the outline of this Tom and Jerry bomb, but this outline of this bomb is also the outline of the very famous cartoon drawn by Kurt Westergaard in the Gieland Posten, I think in 2006, that I think became the symbol of a massive protest worldwide against this considered to be blasphemous drawings. In a time frame, Netanyahu then represents this cartoon in a way, but emptied as a statistic, as if it's a kind of formal statistic, in a time where renewed protests, in this case because of the life of Mohammed, or I can't remember exactly the name of the film that has currently been...
The Innocence, I think.
Yeah, oh, sorry, yes, exactly. What was it? The Innocence of Muslims? Yes, the
Innocence of Muslims.
Yes, which has currently been circulating around. So for me, this was would have been the entry point of using that specific image.
Do you have it on your computer, perhaps?
No.
But I think everyone remembers it.
Or will remember it.
Yeah. I have a question, actually, a rather straightforward question at first to you, Jonas, with at a certain point in your talk, which was, as Mihnea said, very intensive, that I had a certain intensive lapse at a moment where you were talking about the parallels between institutional critique and Occupy, where you were saying that on the one hand, institutional critique is questioning the very foundations of art's showing, and questioning the very foundations, practically, of what we call art. Evacuating the art object is something that's valorized and really making the frame the main subject. And then you said that actually Occupy was enacting the same thing in public space with regard to the political procedures, structures of this democratism that we somehow have in front of ourselves. And my question is really this. Institutional critique has often criticized itself or been criticized from outside for being a sort of governmental way of speaking, or maybe to use Mihnea's terms, an allegorical way of attacking the institution, of performing a transparent and ultimately recognizable critique that then is in its recognition practically also legitimates the institution itself. And this is a long kind of continual discussion about institutional critique that actually surfaced during the first Former West Congress in Utrecht some years ago, so I thought that I would bring this up. My question to you is then this: is Occupy actually doing something similar, or could one critique it as such? Is it perhaps not going the anti-foundationalist route, as one would almost always assume, but actually creating a kind of allegorical rehearsal for more democratism in a different form, perhaps, performed in a different way and now rehearsed or reproduced by the populace at large in its new forms that do seem to have a kind of allegorical way of speaking, actually, about the non-foundationalist moment. I wonder how you would handle that, and maybe then I would also, after you answer, I would readdress the question to Mihnea and see what he thinks, if it's possible to actually escape this allegorizing that we've been talking about throughout. Because that would be the
so I think at first for me, I understand, as I attempted to introduce in the lecture, I understand institutional critique not as a movement that has the research that has the risk of permanently legitimizing institutions by providing it the criticality that makes it possible to defend itself as a transparent, self-critical, self-rejuvenating institution. I believe that the essence of institutional critique is about institutional reform, the belief of institutional reform, by trying to understand how, as artists, our practice as artists are being framed and the interests that we serve by being artists. We try to understand, we try to shape not only literally our works, but the infrastructure itself that contextualizes these works. And I think this, in essence, is a project of reform with a revolutionary potential, and in that sense, at its best moments, touches upon the movement of Occupy. Then, concerning the Occupy protests, I apologize for those who were in Graz last week, where we also discussed similar subject. For me, what is interesting about Occupy is what the level in which it reenacts existing ideas of institutions and the moments that there are differences. So, for example, I told you somehow at moments the protest turned into its worst mirror. I remember even a general assembly. General assemblies were the kind of daily meetings of the camp in which it was proposed to build a wall around the protest, so to protect ourselves from all kinds of risks from junkies or violent presences in the camp. And as in the form of the protest itself mimics, I think, two things. First, of course, our idea of a protest from a kind of 60s, 70s era. So it is almost a kind of cliché reenactment of what we remember we thought was a protest a long, long time ago. So it really enacts also a kind of nostalgia for having this protest back in the present, but then it mixes with a very corporate logic. So Occupy protests all over the world are also always, in essence, are always the same. So there's always the same way of making decisions in the camp. It's always this kind of tents set on the square. There are some basic political infrastructures that are always repetitive, very similar to corporate chains, like the way that McDonald's in Switzerland sells only meat from Switzerland and promotes that also as something that makes a global corporate chain local. And I think Occupy did something similar. But then the question, of course, is if we always, in every attempt to change or oppose existing system, we always reenact part of the system. And then history obviously always repeats itself, but the question is, what is the moment where it doesn't? What are these this kind of minimum moments where history somehow seems exactly the same, but something switches? And I think the core of what happened, the core of the Occupy protest, and it being part of a global democratization movement, international democratization movement, maybe rather international than global, is, I think, this will, what I call the will to start working, to be confronted with our incapacity to imagine this protest differently, but rather to do it in a collective sphere than not to. So it's a way, Jörg Scheran called it acting despite the hesitancy to act, questioning what could be a potential different future, rather in a collective than alone. And I think in this sense, the protest has been enormously important in representing our horizons as far as they got up until today. And the wish to no longer outsource political responsibility over them, but to somehow confront these ourselves. So the fact that the protests, in a way, show a world worse than the one we live in today is their importance. Because the people involved are willing to live in a world worse than today if it's theirs, if they can take personal responsibility over it, the internalized politics to confront the politics that we have also internalized, not to believe in a simple bad outside and a good protest, or the fundamental democracy's protest and democratism as a kind of outside evil, but to recognize and confront these mechanisms in ourselves. So it's a broad answer, but best I can do.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jonas has clarified very nicely his position. To an extent, my answer to the question whether an exit from allegorical terrain is possible was formulated in my talk, that the only form in which the converse of allegory can exist is in the form of a permanently rehearsed oath and a permanently sensed obligation, that there is no evident exit from allegory. But the excitement, let's say, and the joy and the novelty of something like the Bradshaw paintings can reconstellate all these oaths and obligations and aspirations and desires into moments spots in time when things appear to be possible. But I also don't fully agree, I don't fully adhere to the idea of the art space as a place of necessary performance, a place of necessary effectiveness. I think what is necessary in the art space is the examination, of course, and not the verification of the extent to which this examination has measurable impact beyond the confines of the art space.
So actually service or whom to serve is maybe not the most important thing in your
It's the most
view.
important question,
It's the
but
most
it's
important
not
question.
the most important answer, in a way. Yeah.
But you think that the question to serve is still...
The question needs
this
to be
examination must always serve.
This
must always
examination
be
must always be performed while attempting to be permanently aware of who it serves and in whose service it places itself. An exit from that, a liberation from that scenario of self-interrogation is not possible, I think. We'll be always trapped in the allegorical hall of mirrors that we surround ourselves in the logic of the art space, I think.
But yet, what seems so fascinating about the Bradshaw paintings is actually we don't know whom they served. We know that they serve, we know that they live.
They
but
serve
we don't
themselves.
know, there's a whole, if you read about them a little bit more in detail, it's a whole history of myths surrounding them that came up in the relatively small time since their discovery, about that it was maybe some aliens who made them with some amazing technologies, or maybe it was actually people from outside of Australia who were not related. So you have a kind of a very strange myth of different uses.
Yeah, there's actually, looking at it from a different perspective, there are three categories of prehistoric paintings in Australia, and the Bradshaw paintings seem to be the single object that fits in the third category. There are paintings that have been repainted by descendants of the prehistoric man, by Aboriginals, always, forever. There are paintings to which access today by the Aboriginal people has been prohibited by Australian authorities, and that's a political scandal, of course, because they are disrupted in the performance of what is their rightful ritual. And then there's a Bradshaw painting that was never repainted. Pictures in that area, the whole of West Kimberley has been spared for some reasons that are not also, I mean, that complicate the mystery, has been always spared this process of, I wouldn't describe it as destruction. It would have been interesting to have been able to survey, let's say, the whole expanse of time over which what was initially a prehistoric image was progressively defaced and reconstructed by this ulterior level, layers of paint applied by. So it's an exception from that point of view as well. It's neither a site where access of the Aboriginal population is forbidden, nor a site where they have willfully exerted themselves artistically and ritually.
Maybe this is a good moment to open up the floor to questions from the audience. I think there's a microphone here, so if you raise your hand and then introduce yourself for the camera so everyone knows who's speaking. Who would like to begin? Dimitri? Nice to see you.
Thanks for your very insightful presentations. I'm Dmitry Vilensky from Что делать? And my question actually to Jonas, and I would like to try to link, first talk about How Much Fashion by Natasha, and actually your talk where you so clearly marked as mainstream of contemporary art as pure propaganda of certain values. But how far you could connect these values with inscribed fascistic inclination? Because from my point of view, I always was speculating that it's kind of propaganda of commodity fetishism. But for me, it's a big tricky how directly relate to that kind of imminent fascistic core of that kind of articulations.
Yes. I think for me, the moment, I guess, in my talk that touches most on Natasha's introduction is the moment where Donald Duck wakes up back into the US and is confronted with the shadow of the Statue of Liberty, which he thinks to recognize as a Nazi salute. This is not, there would be the obvious critique in which you say, this shows how actually the politics of the US are the exact same as that of Nazi Germany, which is a very uninteresting analysis, which I think the question how much fascism is able to break with. In the Netherlands, I think since the end of the Second World War, the first decades we've been dealing with fascism as a term to immediately disqualify our opponents, and now since the first political murder in the Netherlands on the right conservative Pim Fortuyn in 2002, it's been the absolute opposite. Using fascism is seen as a way to disqualify in a negative sense. So it went from disqualification in a positive sense to a negative sense. And the question how much fascism is much more interesting, also in relation, I think, to the Occupy protest, because it states that fascism as an internalized logic, as a series of, as first also as a strongly aesthetic discourse, but that brings about certain obsessions with disciplinary practice, the idea of organization, mass organization as a goal in itself, without any necessary ideological framing, except for the permanent being together and being the one people and working towards this one absolute future of our nation. I think these elements we still find back in a variety of cultural practices today, whether it's in art, whether it's in the protest movement, whether it's in commercial culture. So the brilliancy of the question how much fascism is that it allows us to think in fascism in the sense of, in a gradual sense, as something that is always present and of which we cannot escape of as actors ourselves. As such, I think it is interesting, and as such, I also propose my own research into contemporary propaganda as something that we are all inevitably actors in, inside or outside the cultural field. It doesn't limit itself to that. I hope that's something of an answer. No, you look at me as if you want to ask something else, something more.
May I just, as a short continuation, I'm sorry to occupy the microphone, but at the same time, how would you reflect? Because actually, okay, we agree to a certain moment of propaganda, but at the same time, first of all, that models of criticality, self-questioning, because actually what separate, or at least if you try to trace a little bit that kind of border between what is propaganda and what is not, that implicit mode of criticality. Doesn't matter how weak, soft, but at the same time, it's permanent question of its own language, which actually I find in the concept of modernity, that is presumption. That's why actually operating with such a strong term as propaganda, it really needs to differentiate. So my question is the whole project of Western art, as you presented in the form of ideological concept, could be called as propaganda. Because for me, that question in itself is a very important mode of existing. And then it's also, for me, it was a little bit undifferentiated with you because there are different modes of instrumentalization of certain even emancipatory practices that were embedded in the project of modernity, in American version, European one, in bourgeois version, which somehow you're trying to escape and kind of generalize.
Yes, good point. So, first, I think, just to make clear that for me, I propose the concept of, or I follow the concept of total propaganda, meaning that, yes, the whole of Western art production can one way or another be framed or be understood, or even has to be understood politically, ideologically, economically. These are conditions that we cannot take away in our perception of art practice. There's also no way of escaping from propaganda in the sense of somehow being less or there's no way of escaping from the political sphere in which acts of cultural production become a form of propaganda. But I do believe that what Fraser calls the relative autonomy, where I follow up on with relative illegality, the reflexivity that is a potential critical tool of art, allows us to be more precise about the type of politics that we wish to defend. And I think the process of differentiation should not be between if something is propaganda and what is not, what kind of propaganda, what kind of political project are we serving, how to start, which for me is a very important task, how to start speaking of democracies instead of democracy, what kind of names do we have, what kind of words can we find to make clear that when we speak of democracy, equality, diversity, we are not speaking of the same thing. What are the consequences for art practice? For me, these are the key questions, but I agree that in the 45 minutes that I had, I have not been very precise yet about the variety of different democracies that we could still speak of and the different artistic practices that are connected to these different concepts of democracies, and this will be something that this is the key element of my research now.
Yes.
I'll bring it on. I mean, you can still take the microphone.
Bring it on. Okay.
This is primarily for Jonas Staal, but of course, hi, my name's Christopher Thomas from London. Yeah, I'd be interested in what the other panelists think about this too. First of all, thank you very much for a brilliant paper. I'd like to ask you about how the actuality of the New World's Summit measures up to the theses of your presentation. The Iranian philosopher Reza Negrestani writes very well on how a liberal empire protects itself from the outside by being strategically open to it. So I don't need to be affected by you because I can afford to be open to you. And you've already talked about how institutions require critique to maintain their authority. So how does the New World Summit escape the strategic openness, as Negrestani would call it, of kind of pre-negotiated critique?
Wow, that's kind of like an uppercut question, huh? First you thank somebody for their talk, and then it's like you deliver it straight up. So, for me, when I introduced the New World Summit, I proposed the term radical diplomacy as a way of making clear that for me, the summit is not simply a way of giving voice to the voiceless, of those suppressed by democratism, what is called, or the organizations that are labeled, part of the organizations that are labeled as terrorists, placed on the international terrorist lists. They are not necessarily, they're not only victims. Their use of violence gives them an active voice in the public sphere. There's also many organizations, for example, there's always been enormous critique from communities, Tamil communities against the Tamil Tigers, for completely monopolizing the debate about possible peaceful solutions for an independent state or province or country, because of the permanent use of violence and the refusal to enter into any negotiations. For me, the demand that comes from the summit is that of mutual accountability. I think that this is the clearest way in which an unconsequential openness or an unconsequential tolerance is being opposed by the organization as I propose it, the summit as I propose it. To speak means that each minute you speak is each minute that you will be interrogated on your political thoughts and ideals and positions, that you also share the space with organizations that are of fundamental opposite position to you. But if you are willing to do it, it also means that you engage in a potentially larger and more principled democratic platform. But I see I recognize, of course, the critique that you're proposing, the risk of this being unconsequential. But I believe that the mutual accountability is the right answer to that.
I think we have time for one more question. Or two more. There seems to be quite two more, yeah. So.
Hi, hello. My name is Eva Pel, and I would thank you for the inspiring lecture. It was very clear.
Oh, sorry, yes.
And a question for you, Jonas. A few questions. Do you think there's a link between the Congress for Cultural Freedom with promoting abstractionist art and your new World Summit, Berlin, with radical diplomacy and terrorist parties, like the terrorists as artists? My second question is, whom are you serving? Or can you answer that question? But maybe that's not very easy. But are you maybe serving Andrea Fraser, or is Andrea Fraser serving you?
Wow.
And then my third question is about, I'm not so familiar with democratism. It's kind of a new term, but democracy. But I was wondering, you talked about the monopolies of violence, representation, information, history. And shouldn't there be, in your idea, the monopoly of love? So the monopoly of love as an adding of the democratism.
Wow. Somehow the monopoly.
So three questions in this.
There seems to be some kind of uncomfortable link between this monopoly of love and the question if I'm serving Fraser or Fraser is serving me. I'm not sure if I should go into this kind of, it's a bit of a death trap question, no? But the first question, if there's a link between the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the New World Summit, is a very, very interesting one that I am afraid I will have difficulty to answer so fast. So let's start with the question that I might be able to answer when it comes to the question of whom am I serving? I mean, the question of Fraser is, of course, put very polemically in the idea, the concept of service suggests also a victimization of the person that is working in service of something else. And in my case, I propose an active engagement as a result of relative autonomy, of a result of the reflexivity that I believe is inherent to a critical art practice and makes it possible, or might make it possible, in the context of total propaganda, to differentiate or distinguish different agendas to whom we could commit ourselves. But for me, it's more about fidelity or about loyalty than about being of service. But of course, my question comes in dialogue with Fraser, so this is why I use this term. What I hopefully made clear in my lecture is that when it comes to what I am at service to or dedicate myself is the exploration of what I call fundamental democracy, what an egalitarian space in differentiation of democratism could be today through engagement with different political organizations, but also by creating political organizations myself, such as the New World Summit, who tries to supplement, and in its supplementation, provide a fundamental critique of the democratism as we know it today. The link between the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the New World Summit, at least I don't know. It's a really good question. It's a really good question. I know already that there is, but I'm not intellectually capable now to make this immediate link. Do you have an idea?
Oh, Well, not yet, but maybe at the end of the day we can have a conversation. But yeah, I think there's definitely a link because you researched of definitely this Congress, and I think also that it's very political, the Congress of Freedom, Cultural Freedom, because of the CIA was involved. So, and you're...
But nobody knew. I mean, it only became known in '66, I think, that the CIA was the one actually financing, together with the Ford Foundation, the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which has brought Jackson Pollock all over the world and Willem de Kooning up until the Venice Biennial. So this is something that is only known in retrospect. At the time, the quote that I showed was the kind of framing of the Congress was that of cultural producers engaging themselves in mutual critical conversation on how the monopoly on art and freedom of speech by the Soviet Union could be broken or opposed through visualizing, proposing an art that fitted with the idea of liberal democracy. So this was not known at the time, and of course what I try to do with the summit is create a visibility of interests to make visible all the interests, mutual interests that define such a political site as far as it's possible. This is inherent, I think, to make visible also the process of exclusion that take place in even such a symposium, being confronted, for example, with having to select audience, to control them, to ask for their passports, to have safety measures for our speakers, the limited capacity of such a space. Every act of inclusion also immediately has a consequence of something else being excluded. Then the question is, do you accept this, or in case of my work, do you attempt to systematically make visible what one at one moment includes and another excludes, as a kind of continuous exploration of what egalitarian politics could be? I would say this is the difference, not so much the overlap, but the difference between the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the Summit.
And my last question, are you in favor of the monopoly of love?
I don't know what the monopoly of love means. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Hi, Nick Akins from the Van Abbe Museum at Eindhoven. I was thinking how to formulate a question, and then this question regarding the comparisons between the Congress and the Summit perhaps gave an answer. Maybe I can try and formulate a very simple distinction, and at the end try and get a question out of it. The former being quite simply politicians using art, and the latter being artists using politics. Perhaps might be one very simple binary. But then I was listening to your speech, Jonas, and your talk, and you talking about the US's use of culture as a political ideological tool. And there seemed to be perhaps a neglect of the kind of game change which we're now in, which is post-89, and this ideological binary no longer there, and art as no longer as a useful ideological tool. And one clear offshoot of that would be the lack of funding that governments no longer give cultural producers, because it's no longer useful as this ideological tool. So I was just wondering how this then affects your use of propaganda by governments. Is it no longer useful propaganda for them? Could it become more useful propaganda for artists in their ideological
I mean, the switch in the Dutch context is obvious, that art still serves a very important propagandistic a role for the state, but in an opposite sense. By denouncing art, art has received of a great importance. By making art into an artist into the word that somehow comprises the failure of the failure of multicultural dream, the interests in the other, to include excluded voices. Somehow you see all the enemies of the last government, its attack on independent judges, on migrant communities, on education, on, I mean, name it. You can somehow all see them reflected in the attack on the artist as a symbol, as an excess of what they call the I mean, they call it the left-wing hobby, as an excess of the leftist nightmare somehow. So in that sense, there is a very strong propagandistic use that art has, but in the way that it is denounced. Then, of course, the question that should be asked in reverse is, and that the Dutch institutions and Dutch artists had a lot of trouble with, is what is our mutually ideological response? But at that moment, we were confronted with having to defend an infrastructure of which we could not even recognize its ideological foundations anymore. When Caroline Gerels, the image I showed, the Labour Party official, alderman, threw a stone at the Stedelijk, everybody was angry. Why? Because she made visible once again that the cultural infrastructure in the Netherlands is not neutral, but is founded on social democratic principles that her party defends. In a weird way, she takes in an avant-garde position by bringing back this ideological debate based on a very, in that sense, conservative ideal, or like an ideal that comes from the past. But in bringing it back in our time, in such a depoliticized time, can be seen as an ideological avant-garde move from a politician. So for me, my exploration in the talk has been about somehow trying to make visible how in the ideological battlefield we're in today, where we have to choose sides, where we have for a long time chose sides. All of our artistic institutions are completely corrupted by the so-called neoliberalist politics that they say they oppose, but that they have to serve day by day by finding private sponsorship, by providing the right educational programs, by being friends with local politicians. I mean, this is obvious, only nobody wants to talk about the obvious. And because of that, the right-wing parties were willing to do it. Because of that, we were confronted with an total ideological vacuum to respond. So my talk has attempts to re-establish what this ideological context was in the past, in the 50s when our cultural infrastructure was developed, and what it could be today with the concept of fundamental democracy at hand.
Maybe there's time for a final question, and then maybe we should adjourn for lunch.
Yeah, my name is Simon Sheikh. I work with Former West as a researcher. I had, well, actually several questions, but I thought maybe I would just take one, which relates a little bit to the debate before, which was the parallel between abstract painting and the idea of the summit. And it relates to something that you said, Jonas, in your talk, where you placed, in a way, in a chronology, but also in a sort of dialectical development, you placed Pollock as one figuration and Andrea Fraser as the other figuration. And as I understand it, what you did was you made Pollock into a symptom, and you made Andrea into an analyzer. But perhaps it would be fair to also do the opposite. Because first of all, I don't agree with you that Pollock is completely unconscious of what was happening to him. But regardless of that art historical detail, let's say, what if he was an analyzer of a particular moment of production of capitalism, which has to do with also the Fordist, post-Fordist divide, and that then Andrea would be the figuration, which was the term you used, of another moment where exactly capital has become semioticized and linguistic. What would she then be? Could we then read her as a symptom? And what would then be? Would it be possible not to think of these figures as opposites, but also as parallels? And that could maybe lead us into, hopefully also later today, a discussion of then the third idea of the summit. What would that then signify as a parallel and or opposition in our time of production?
Wow. I agree. It was not my attempt in the talk to say that somehow Pollock is the. I mean, yes, I juxtaposed Pollock as the artist absolutely unconscious of the framing through which his work is being sent out, spread through the world as the ultimate symbol of a freed nation in opposite to a suppressed Soviet Union in which depicting the great leaders has become daily practice. And Fraser as a kind of liberator of that. I mean, Fraser is at the same time provides, I think, the tool to critically reassess our positions as artists within ideological, political, economic spheres, and at the same time embodies the absolute incapacity of getting out of that position, in the sense of imagining another point of departure than the institution to start from. I think that is this is the difficulty, that the tools of institutional critique are as valuable today as when they were, as when she engaged with them. The question now is, who do we serve with these tools? Being critical, the wish to be critical, already suggests that there is such a thing as a common space we inhabit. If you are critical at a institution, other speaker, whatever, it means that you legitimize their position as being as something that occupies a shared space, with which you would like to occupy a shared space. And today, with the status of the institutions, the political agendas they serve, as she showed in her latest article, L'Important, c'est moi, the question is, should we even want to continue that project? And this is why I attempt to propose a different site, a different political context, different political event, or different political horizon to situate the questions of institutional critique in. Then your question about in what way my New World Summit would be a parallel and or opposition to that, I think I explained as much as I could about the summit so far. So, but I will keep this question in mind together with the relation with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. The question is how the New World Summit was financed. The New World Summit was completely financed by cultural institutions, which I had to convince that none of them was paying for the travel expenses or of the actual speakers, which was very interesting. Cultural institutions are only willing to, of course, invest in the visual infrastructure that will serve as a platform for certain political events, but they cannot pay for the actual political event. So all of my financial partners at the end think that they have all paid only for the architecture, but then of course you have to use each of them to finance the actual content of the summit. But at the moment at the summit, multiple organizations were present that are engaged with diplomatic issues, with conflict studies, and with them we are now discussing to finance the future summits, which I'm really happy about, because it's a form of finance that somehow circulates in a kind of NGO-related sphere in between the state and what we could consider what is an unfree, but is discussed as a free market, which in that sense would also be a way of escaping from certain demands that come from the cultural sphere that I'm not always willing to match or capable of matching.
Okay, thank you, Jonas. Thank you, Mihnea. Thank you, all of you, for such a stimulating morning session. And I think we now adjourn for lunch and coffee and drinks, non-alcoholic kind. And we will come back here at 2:30 and continue. So thank you and see you soon.